I'll do my best, though. Hey, I got it read.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
It's more than some people did.
So,
I even made it easy on him. I even downloaded it on his phone so he could just listen to it when he drives.
yeah. That's a good way of doing it.
Yeah.
And she still threw me under the bus.
Well, so yeah, we are asking you to memorize. This is sort of a challenge for you all. Not that I obviously can't give you a grade that means anything. So, we're asking you people who take this to memorize the first 18 verses. I think it'd be a good exercise because these 18 verses are so important to the rest of the gospel. Even to our understanding of who Jesus is, which we're going to talk a lot about that this evening. And we are also challenging you to read the gospel in between each class session. So the entirety of the gospel between each session. And it takes about an hour. And how long did it take you, he said, Bob?
Hour and 20.
Hour and 20 minutes. So not too long, especially if you were to stretch that out over 6 days, 6 or 7 days. So let's recap a little bit and see what were the main worldview points that we talked about for John, right? So when we talk about worldview, we're talking about John's understanding of the world around him. And
Amazes me that you can draw that.
I don't know that that's all that fantastic.
But I recognize it, so it's not bad.
Rome.
All right, so Rome. And what was the deal with Rome?
Well, it was basically the persecutions.
Okay, so yeah.
And their rule.
Yeah, so the first and second persecutions, right? And that did a lot to change the perspective of the believers, so when you're being persecuted, kind of is a big deal. And of course, they were in control of the known world. All right, so what was the second one?
Destruction.
All right, the temple. And primarily it's destruction. All right, and the third one? The Jews. The Jews. And whenever we see that word in the Gospel of John, we need to say it with derision. The Jews. But not so that we can be claimed as anti-Semitic, because we certainly don't want that.
Come on.
But the Jews in the Gospel of John are the enemy. So they are the bad guys. You got a problem with that? You can take it up with God. So. All right, so Rome, temple, Jews. There's two more.
Heretics.
Those pesky heretics. And I suddenly forget how to spell it.
Heretics.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it?
Okay, and we're primarily talking about Gnostics.
Oh, it's got a G in it?
Yep.
I should know that.
That's because it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which looks like this.
Is that part of agnostic? Is that? I've always heard that word, agnostic.
No,
Who's an agnostic is a.
No, an agnostic is somebody who believes that there is a God, but really has no defined deity. Gnostics or Gnosticism is from the Greek word gnosis. and it means knowledge. So it's like a secret or revealed knowledge that only the special elite have, right? So they claimed that Jesus did not come in the flesh, that he was only an appearance, right? And that he so when they saw his resurrection, it wasn't like he actually his body came back to the land of the living. It was just an appearance of him anyway. So it wasn't like this great big miracle that all the apostles and everybody claimed it to be. So this is who John is arguing with in his epistles in 1st through 3rd John. The Gnostics are really more of a 2nd century problem, but they're starting to creep into the church. So people like Irenaeus and Polycarp and all those Papias, all those good people who are strong in the faith and on John's side, all write these great big treaties, against Gnosticism and why they're all heretics, and says some very not nice things about them. But the truth hurts. So, all right, and then the final thing. Community. Okay, and I'm not talking about the TV show, which I'm sure none of you have seen. So, all right, so community, because of all these things, John is circling the wagons around his people, defining who is in and who is out. Basically, if you're with me, you're with God. All right, and if you're not with me, then hope you like the fire, right? Because he's that bold. 1 John is pretty straightforward. If you do this or if you believe this, then you're good. If you don't do this or if you do this, then you're not part of us. So, he makes it very cut and dry, which is what you do when you're being attacked from all sides. They're being attacked from within, from the heretics. They're being attacked from their religious brethren, the Jews. They're being attacked by their government, Rome. So, they're literally getting it from everybody. And so he has to protect his people. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and actually get into the lesson for this evening. That was a good recap.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so introduction. Oh, yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, question 1. What is the purpose of a prologue for a novel? Any novel?
Background.
I'm sorry?
Give you background.
Yeah, all right. So it's going to give you background. What else?
Kind of introduces what it's about, maybe what it's going to happen.
Yeah, so it's a form of an introduction. What are some other things that you get in the prologue? These are good broad statements, maybe a little more specific words.
Character?
Yeah, you're going to get you mean like characters,
So,
like
yeah,
the protagonist, yeah. Yeah, so characters, very good. That's definitely key. What else are you going to get?
Well, it sometimes tells backstory of what's about to begin.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, it's going to give you the backstory, kind of like how an epilogue gives you the resolution.
Yeah.
Right. What else are we going to get in a prologue? How about purpose? You're going to get the purpose of the story. Like, why is this story being told in the first place?
Maybe if there's a conflict, you could introduce to the conflict.
Yep.
Or whatever.
So introduce conflict. All right. The only thing left that I can think of would be like important themes. The author will start dropping foreshadowing and kind of the major concepts or themes of the story. You know, like good versus evil, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's what the purpose is of a prologue. Missing a slide. The next question there is, what specific information is traditionally shared in the prologue? Well, I think we've addressed that anyways. So, all right. So in that little paragraph there under question 2, in the opening verses of each of the 4 Gospels, the evangelists provide initial clues to the interests that will govern their respective accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. For example, Mark's opening is the most compact, recounting Jesus' baptism in order to establish his identity as the Son of God. Matthew's opening genealogy identifies Jesus as a descendant of both Abraham and David, as well as supplying his credentials as the Messianic king. While Luke's introduction sets a detailed account of the announcements and actual births of both John the Baptist and Jesus against the backdrop of the wider Roman world. Of the 4, however, John makes the most dramatic use of the prologue form in shaping the contours of a particular Christological emphasis. Okay. So, let's go ahead and get into the text, analyze these 18 verses a little bit. I will tell you that the text that I have on the screen and in your handouts is, I believe it's the Holman Christian Standard, okay, which is a good intermediate text, perhaps between like the NASB, which is very rigid and very strict to the Greek, and say the New Living Translation, which is very free and very liberal with the text. Can I get some volunteers to read?
How much do you want read?
Well, we're going to just read the whole 18 verses. So if you could read like a slide at a time, that'd be good.
Can I read it off my paper?
Yeah.
Or do you want me to say the verse numbers or just read?
No.
All right. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him not one thing was created that has been created. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man named John who was sent from God. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all men might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, but his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, or the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son, from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him and exclaimed, "This was the one of whom I said, 'The one coming after me has surpassed me because he existed before me.' Indeed, we have all received grace after grace from his fullness. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the one and only Son, the one who is at the Father's side. He has revealed him."
Okay, thank you. So, all right. So we've all probably read those verses before. If you're reading the gospel in between each week, then obviously you have, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to read a very rigid version of those same 18 verses that I got from my professor while I was at Cincinnati. And so this is his translation. He even leaves some of the words in their Greek, primarily logos, which is one of the words that we'll talk about. Ironically, it's the word for word. So if I could get a volunteer to please read this translation.
In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was before God, in the presence of God, not a time reference. And God was the Logos. This one was in the beginning before God. All things became through him, and without him became not one thing which has become. In him was life, and the life was the light of humanity. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. A man became, being sent from God, named John. This one came to witness, so that he should witness concerning the light, so that all people should believe through him. That one was not the light, but rather he came, so that he should witness concerning the light. It was the true light, which lights all people by coming into the world. It was in the world, and the world became through it, and the world did not know him. To his own he came, and his own did not receive him. But as many as
many as believed in him.
Believed him. He gave to them authority to become children of God. To thrones, believing on his name, who were not begotten from blood, nor from the will of flesh, nor from the will of a man, husband, but rather from God. The Logos became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as an only born from a Father, full of grace and truth. John witnesses concerning him, having cried out, saying, "This one was whom I said, 'The one coming behind me became ahead of me, because he was before me.' Because from his fullness we all received also grace in place of grace. Because the law was given through Moses, grace and truth became through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. Only begotten God, being in the bosom of the Father, the same narrated about him."
Okay. So you've got both translations right there next to each other on the page for your convenience.
Didn't notice that till just now. Thanks, Jonathan.
It's what I do. So here's what I'd like to do now as sort of a brief exercise is what do you notice between the two translations that are different and maybe like stylistically different? What phrases are even have maybe different meanings? So go ahead and read through that, and you can do it with a partner grouping or whatever if you want to, so you don't have to do it by yourself. But go ahead and look through and just kind of compare the two and contrast them. So.
What I see is actually good. It's good. This is more like a prose or poetry, and this is more like a prose. mean, that's what sticks out at first for me.
You wanna pick out the ones that are like the same, and I'll pick out what's different.
Well, we have the obvious order, right?
I don't know if this bracket means that it means
Yeah.
it, or if that just means that
So that's it. All brackets are not on its side, it's like
This is
continue.
the actual.
I think
This
this,
one has three lines, and that's four.
so that would just clarify
And this is the,
where you can mean. I think this side mentions John, that side
And
just
this
assumes
mentions
John.
that it was on the time records, well, that's
Oh.
in parentheses.
If it's in brackets, then that was added by Tom.
By him.
so it could make sense,
Yeah.
so it reads easier.
Or to explain what
Yeah.
he means.
Before comes that.
But if it's still the same, he was in, the word was in the beginning, and he was with God in the beginning. Right? It's the same.
Was with him, was before him, so it's not the same thing.
Okay. And
Yeah, so you see it.
life was in him in four, that's the same.
Mhm. That's right.
Somebody testified about the
It's
life.
just
It says
stated
he
a different
witnessed
way.
Like
In
that,
him was
it's
life, but life was in him.
Somebody testified
that
about
is
the
the
light. This one says he
They're all
witnessed concerning
so
the
the
light.
same so far.
The light shines in the
It
darkness.
was in the world, and this says he.
Mhm.
And that's exactly the same.
Mhm.
What he said.
I know, but witness and testify seem to be two different.
John sent from God on both of them.
Witness seems like you
One came to
see it, and that one says you talk
they
it.
should witness concerning the light.
If you witness it, you saw it happen. If you testify, you're talking.
That's the same.
It's just stated a little bit differently, but it's, you could read it and it's still understandable.
But it goes through the light, yeah.
Yeah, he, that's
Didn't recognize him.
kind of weird.
To his own.
And
They
10,
didn't receive
so
it.
he was in the world, and 10, but he was in the world.
You really see it more when you take each one together, when you're just reading the whole.
Oh, and residence of tabernacle
Is,
in 14.
Did not know.
Mm.
Yeah.
13 is a little bit
Yeah.
different. It reads different.
And then 12 says he gave them the right to be the children of God. It says he gave them the authority.
It's talking about those who are the children of God, right?
He's probably wanting to know about what happened at work today.
In order for the will of a man, or a husband and a woman, a man and wife, but rather for God and will of man.
It's the same though.
of man and sower of man.
Here it says John witness. Over here it says John testified.
So why would you put husband in there? It seems like a role. I mean, that seems to be, the will of a man could be single person, young
Grace.
person, old person,
In
but
place of
husband
grace.
seems like.
What's that mean?
That's a little.
That's a good question.
That's a little bit,
It brings
every,
people to
every part, we,
Yeah.
we have all received grace, that's grace. Grace full, so over here, because we
One.
also
I understand
Right, I
that.
know, but like, why wasn't it, why was it?
Yeah.
That
This
here?
one,
Puzzling.
the one
For a
coming
moment.
behind me became.
Till you explain it to
Wait,
us,
are we talking
Lucy.
It's
about
kind
John?
of.
I have an opinion on the matter.
It's talking about
Because he was
John,
good for
or
one day.
we're talking about Jesus then?
It's really not.
Anytime.
So it wasn't
It's
the
not.
husband's, it wasn't.
It's not different, none of
I've
it
never.
really.
Joseph's will to God's will.
The choice of verbiage.
I couldn't get.
So there's a reference to Joseph there, but there isn't that on that side.
Not exactly.
All right, if you guys can wrap up in just a minute or two.
Moses to see what the Lord
We are supposed to.
It's the same thing, only different.
That's what we decided.
Okay.
It's the same, only different.
But that's not good for discussions, so
Doesn't get much on the whiteboard, does it?
no. And you know how I love to fill up whiteboards.
I know.
I don't know why I have such an affection for it, I guess, but
Todd?
I don't know.
Todd seems to use it quite well.
yeah, he does too. He fills it up, and so I had actually it was this Dr. Tom Thatcher. We had chalkboards in the seminary instead of whiteboards, and he wrote everything on the chalkboard. And he would have like this little tiny, he would start out with a whole stick, and by the end of the class, which was 3 hours long, he'd be on to a second, stick of chalk. And I'll never forget, like, it was a week-long intensive. And so we were in the classroom for 8 hours a day for an entire week. And it was actually the Epistles of John class that I took with him. And there was at one point where he had the eraser, right? And he was like beating it on the thing because it was so full of chalk dust and everything. The whole room was just this cloud of chalk dust. You could, like on my laptop, you could go like this and you get chalk on. It was like we all wanted to go in there with masks. It was so bad, but
Silicosis.
huh?
Silicosis.
Silicosis?
Silicosis becomes effective September 23rd in every industry.
This is,
Instructions.
I understand this.
20 the 23rd to come.
This
What is
over
it?
here.
Silica is a
Oh,
natural,
yes.
it's a natural compound of the
Uh-huh.
ground. And if you've been by any construction sites and you see these big pillars of clouds, that's silica dust, and it's same as anything else gets your lungs. You can't get rid of it, the body can't get rid of it. And it's been overlooked for eons, but
Yeah.
they're done overlooking it.
So,
And they have like 0.23 is the threshold, and you can't even garden and not blow the threshold.
oh wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe my love of riding on a board came from that experience.
And yours is silica free.
That's right. Mine doesn't cause people to.
Yeah, well, the smell
Smell.
isn't really fun if you're too close.
All right, everybody, let's go ahead and talk about what is different between the two different translations of the text. So, what stood out to you as different? Because to be honest, that's more important than what's the same. So, what is different?
The actual style it is written in is different.
Okay, so you mentioned that, like, what do you mean?
I mean, it looks to me like the original here that we've got on the left-hand side is like poetry.
Yeah, so this is more
Whereas
like.
the other one is more like prose.
Yeah.
So the actual style it is written in is different.
Can you explain prose and poetry just for the rest of us who are not literature majors?
No, I can't.
So
Poetry is, I don't know.
a
It doesn't have
rhythmic.
to rhyme, it's lines with a certain kind of meter. Whereas prose is you just write it, and when you get done at the end of the sentence, you go to the next sentence, and
Right. So we write papers in prose or narratives in prose,
narratives. That's a good one.
but we write
Special.
expressive
Yes.
language in poetry. So, okay, very good. Yeah, the styles are different. That's probably more because Tom is not a poet, so than anything. But I think it's good that you did notice that the Holy Christian Standard went out of its way to put the text in such a way that it looks like it's in a stanza form, like you would see in a poem, which I think is a good handling of John's intent of the text. What else appears to stand out as different, whether it's surface level or immaterial or whatever?
We are looking. It's not that much different if you understand, except when you get to the last verse.
All right, and what are you talking about in the last verse? Verse 18?
Yes.
Okay, so what's going on there?
Well, it's saying you can understand it better, the one on the left. I mean, you can understand what it's saying closer, but the one on the right isn't. You had to. I don't know. It's just different. I can understand the one on the left.
Yeah.
As I read it,
Mm-hmm.
I understand what it's saying. The one on the right is.
I guess
Confusing.
I would say that the one on the left is more of a common language, where the one on the right.
That's what I told him. I said, we're familiar with
Right.
that.
There is a glaring difference in the two. All right. So I mean, and we have to remember, we have to get past our 2,000 years of Christian theology that's stored up in our heads, right? Because we've all been educated in the church, right? So there in the second line over on the left, the one and only Son. And on the right,
It's the only begotten God. It's
Only
talking about,
begotten God.
but it's one and the same. But it's making reference to a different person. In a sense, well, one says the Son, then one says God. And if we understand the Trinity,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't, you could understand it to be talking about two different people.
Yeah, you can. Now, we would. So the big thing, obviously, is the word Son and God. Right. So only and begotten are synonyms. Okay, not necessarily good synonyms, but they have similar meanings. Right. So what's different here is the usage of Son, which clearly identifies Jesus as the subject, versus just the generic theos, which is the Greek word for God, as just God. So which line is this talking about? Is it referring to God the Father? Is it referring to God the Son? So the Holman Christian Standard people made that translation for us, even though I didn't think they did a really good job of it. So I believe that they both. Tom, I think, is translating word for word. So the word there in the text is the word for God, not Son, and so that's just something we need to consider. Keep that little feather in your hat. We're going to come back to it. All right.
It draws thought process back to the Ethiopian eunuch, and if he was reading this, he would be asking Philip, who is the writer speaking of? He'd be asking Philip, who does he mean?
Right.
Who is it?
Right.
I mean, I could see that if I was reading
Yeah.
this, I'd say,
Yeah.
who's the writer, who's he talking about?
Yeah, and well, people still are asking this question with, say, our Jehovah's Witness friends, right? Which we're going to talk about that towards the end of the class. All right, so what else do you see as different?
Well, we caught verse 13, the one where towards the end it says, or the will of man on the left, but then on the right it says, nor the will of a man husband.
Yeah.
So we kind of thought, is the one that says, nor the will of man husband, is that referring to Joseph if we're talking about Jesus? Or what's this husband?
Okay, so
Because it wasn't Joseph's will that this happened, it was God's will that Jesus came through Mary.
So verse 13, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God, who were not begotten from blood, nor from the will of flesh, nor from the will of a man/husband, but rather from God. So, all right, so the word there in verse 13, so tonight's going to be like the most Greek heavy, all right? Because just what we're doing, I got to talk about Greek words, all right? But I'm not going to like hammer you with them, okay? So I know that's kind of not part of what we were going for, but since you're asking the question, I'm going to answer it, right? So the word there is not the typical word for man, all right? So it's the word andros, which looks like this, and it's the word for like a father or a husband, right? So it could mean man, but it more specifically it's the role of the man that it's addressing. So that's not the general word for man or mankind.
That's what I was thinking. On the left could be mankind.
Mm-hmm.
But in their time frame, they would understand they would know what this meant.
Yeah. Exactly, they would. All right.
I mean, they would know, but them reading that, they'd know what they'd have an understanding of the text.
So the general word for man or mankind is anthropos, and what we have here is andros. So it's different. Very good though, and that was verse 13.
Yeah.
What else do we see that's kind of different?
In 12, the one on the left seems just a little bit more passive. He gave them the right to be children of God, and then he gave to them authority to become children of God.
So right to and authority are two different ways of. Because when you have the right to do something, you have a kind of a choice with whatever. But authority is like you've got the power. No, it's just different. Gives a different kind of.
Yeah, so like right versus authority. We can exercise rights, but that doesn't necessarily we have authority over something. We don't have power over something. So very good.
Hey, we're pretty smart. I'm proud of all this.
They
All right, you mentioned something that I told you was good that I overheard that was a big deal.
Poetry and prose. That's right.
So, like you mentioned about the grace thing.
Yeah.
All right, so what was that?
Grace in place of grace.
Right, so that was verse 16, right?
Yes.
So in verse 16,
This one says grace after grace.
so the Holman Christian Standard tells us it's it's grace after grace, right?
From his fullness. And 16, because from his fullness we received also grace in place of grace.
Right, so Tom is grace in place of grace.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
Well, but you're receiving grace, and it's like you're receiving more grace. You receive grace, but it's even more.
Right, so the Holman Christian Standard, I would say, gives that reading, right? It's not just grace, it's an overflowing grace. It's like an abundance of grace, right? Which is one way to translate that. Tom is actually sticking with the in place of really is the better word or phrase to explain this after. So I mean, this is what's different, right? And that's confusing. So what does grace in place of grace? Because to me, that doesn't sound the same or have the same kind of meaning as grace after grace. And when we look at the context, right, the surrounding sentences, starting there in verse 15, John witnesses concerning him, having cried out, saying, "This." I'm on the right side. "This one was whom I said, the one coming behind me was before me, because from his fullness we all received also grace in place of grace." Verse 17, "Because the law was given through Moses, grace and truth became through Jesus Christ." And so there, so if we were to compare verse 16 to verse 17, we get law, and that is replaced with grace. And so the way that I interpret this, and this I have to say this is strictly kind of a me interpretation, I suppose. People agree or disagree with me, but is that this relates to this. Okay, and so what that does, by the way, I mean that's huge. All right, because when we talk about the law, this is the Ten Commandments, right? This is Genesis through Deuteronomy. All those legalistic rules, right, that we normally say are rules of righteousness. They, I would say, they see the law as grace.
Right.
Right. So to them, the law is a form of grace from God, even though generally, I would say most Christians of today would not agree, or at least come to that conclusion initially. Right? So to a Jew, the very fact that God chose them from all the people of the world, and that he blessed them with his covenant, and that he revealed his holiness to them, that in itself is a form of grace.
Right.
And now it's been replaced with another form of grace, which is the blood of Christ.
Because it tells us in the scriptures, the law made them aware of their sin, which God did through the law, but they received God's grace at that time through the animal sacrifices and being obedient to the law.
Yeah, because even the ability to approach a holy deity without the cross is a form of mercy and grace. So he created a way for the high priest to enter his presence. So yeah, this is very, I believe, a very profound statement that most of our new English translations just have no idea what they're doing with, right? So they just, because this is confusing and this is a lot of stuff packed into one little phrase, so they just say, well, it's an abundance of grace, they go that route. And I seriously think that is a mishandling of what John is trying to say.
When you understand
So I can get all of that.
the Old Testament
Right.
law, the grace received through it, and then comes Christ, that is the grace. We had grace here, but now through Christ and his sacrifice, it just poured it on all that much more. I mean, we had enough money But he just
Right.
kept giving us more and
Yeah.
more, and we just became richer and richer.
Yeah. So, good stuff. There's one more thing that we have to address. And this is more of Tom trying to remain faithful to the text. And that's in verse 14. So, somebody want to read verse 14 from Tom, and someone else read verse 14 from Holman Christian Standard.
Holman. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We observed His glory. The glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
And the Logos became flesh and tabernacled among us. And we saw His glory. Glory is in the only born from a Father, full of grace and truth. Oh, he wasn't done. I think it's too soon.
Okay, so what I see as, and this could be chalked up to style, because essentially they're meaning the same thing, but the word tabernacle carries with it a very rich Old Testament verbiage, right? So what is the tabernacle?
Old Testament, where God dwelled.
Right, it's where God dwelled with His people as they camped around it in the wilderness, right? And the pillar of God. So we're going to actually read that. So from all of that, are there any themes that stick out to you? So what themes seem to be listed through this introduction? What stands out to you?
The Son was with God, but then He left God and came to dwell among us.
Next time you need to put more lines on here so that we can put all that stuff on here. And because now I've written it all where my themes should go, and now I don't know where to put it.
The backside.
Yeah.
What? I'm going to put origin, but know that I'm not talking about the creation of His origin. I'm talking about where He originated from, like His destination. So I just couldn't think of a better word than that. So Jesus' origin from heaven to earth, right? And the thing there. So yeah, this is a very crucial theme that John will elaborate upon in his gospel. What else? What other themes do we see?
I feel like there's two things going on. Like on one hand, like I'm looking at the verses as to the story and what's going on, but then I'm looking at the verses as more of like a I don't know, like I'm picking it apart word by word. Like I'm leaving out like the emotional part, the spiritual part. Like there's two different things going on. So in that stance, I think that it shows me how much when you translate something, it doesn't always translate well.
Okay.
Because things get lost, just like, especially like the tabernacle residence. I mean, that is a huge loss when you switch out that word. And so if it was switched here, how much more does it get switched when you go to other versions that are not done well? Yeah.
So the Message, for example, Jesus moved in. The Word became flesh, and something like that, and moved into the neighborhood is how it put it, right? So it's it hurts my ears to hear that because it just loses all of its right. So it's trying to get the concept of Jesus living here on earth among us, which is what He did in the tabernacle. But you're right, it's just completely ripping it of all of its Old Testament beauty and language and context and all of that. So yeah, and the word here for tabernacle is I believe it's eskonothen. If I can. Anyways, that is eskenosin. We're supposed to talk about this later, but it's all right. We're like, this lesson's kind of all jumbled up now at this point, anyways.
So are my notes.
Just like that, we jumbled it all up.
Where is guinea pigs, you know?
Well, this was probably a much better way of working through it than when. Anyways, so eskenothsin is so when they took the Old Testament, right, which was written in Hebrew and some of it was in Aramaic if you're reading Daniel, right, but Exodus was written in Hebrew. And the word, when they took that Old Testament translation of Hebrew and translated it into the common language of the day, which was classical Greek when it was written, the word that they used for tabernacle in the Old Testament is eskenosin, the same word that John uses here in John 1:14. So he is deliberately picking up this word that he knows is the same, has the exact same meaning that it did in Exodus, and using it here for this purpose. And tabernacled, literally, it just means like pitching a tent, like it means to set up a tent. Like that's literally what it means.
But he wants us to be. He wanted them to be. He wanted to be sure that they understood that he was living here with us.
Mm-hmm.
That it was truly God here.
Right. That same experience that happened with Moses and with all of the forefathers of Israel, right? That same thing is happening now again, but in an even more intimate way. Right?
More grandiose.
Yeah. And so, the tabernacle was able to be picked up and moved, right? And so wherever the people of Israel went, there went the presence of God. And so even now, like Jesus if he's the tabernacle now, then anywhere he's going, he's spreading the presence of God on earth. And so, even just the whole imagery of a mobile temple, which is what the tabernacle was, and that Jesus is a mobile temple. So anyways, I could talk about that for another 15, 20 minutes, but
another thing.
Yeah.
The light.
Light. Bingo.
The light
Yep.
came into the dark world.
Light is going to be huge in the Gospel of John. Bad things happen at night in the Gospel. Right? Nicodemus goes and sees Jesus at night. Judas betrays Jesus at night. He has his trials at night. So all the bad stuff happens at night. The day turns to darkness when Jesus is on the cross. Bad things happen at night in the Gospel of John. What else? What other themes do we see?
I don't know if it's a theme or not, but it's a big deal to me, like in verse 10, that they didn't recognize him.
Yeah. So, did not recognize. So, you want to explain that a little bit more? Like what you mean by that? Like, why is that important to you?
Well, I heard a message given one time, and it was along those lines. And like they had the presence of, in their actual vision, in their actual eyes, and in their relationship, he was there, and they missed him.
Yeah.
And it's just to think that they actually had.
Well, there's people that are that way now. Right?
There you have the physical to go along with it. Yeah, for sure people don't get it today either, but my thinking was that they had in the flesh there in their presence and didn't get it, didn't recognize it.
Well, and he continually reiterated that fact that you alluded to, Greg, and whenever they were giving him his mock trial, Jesus told him himself that you don't know what you're doing, you don't know who I am. I'm telling you. You say, are you a king?
To go along with what you're saying, something that's coming up all throughout this prologue and something that comes up all throughout the gospel is the concept of truth and witness. Right? So Jesus shares the truth with them, but they do not recognize it. Jesus is a witness. In the Gospel of John, everything bears witness to who Jesus is. His signs, his I am statements, right? So all of the all of his sermons give credit to who he is. John, I think it's chapter 6 and 7, maybe, talks about witnesses, right? And how many witnesses are necessary for a testimony to be true. Right? And so all throughout the gospel, he's talking about truth and witness. Something else that...
But with their knowledge, this is just me, they knew, but they didn't want to acknowledge.
Well,
they saw the signs, they knew the Old Testament scriptures, they knew what pointed to Christ, they knew about the miracles that would be worked. They seen them.
Yeah.
There's others that seen it and knew, and they believed. They seen it and they chose not to believe. They didn't want to believe.
Yeah. I can get behind that.
Because it destroyed everything that they had here in our little apple cart, and it's upsetting it. We've got a deal going on here. And even though this is God, we don't care. We like this better than what he wants to tear everything up.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you could say that about all of them.
Oh, no, not
but
all of them.
There's probably certainly a group of them that had that for sure.
One that the Pharisees.
Yeah.
The council.
The Jews, right? So, all right. That's some good stuff. We got to move on because we're running out of time. We got about a half hour left, and I'll do my best to get you out on time this week because that didn't happen last week. All right. So, was and becoming. Right now, if you would take a few minutes to read through. I'd be honest with you, it'd probably be easier to do it with Tom's translation because he uses the right words a little bit more often.
So we need to look up was and becoming and how many times they're used?
Yeah, was and becoming. Not just like the verses in which you find those words, all right? And we'll kind of draw some meaning from all of that. Did everybody get this down that wanted it?
Just let me take it.
From 1 to 18. From 1 to 18, that's what you're talking about?
Yep.
And then I can copy off of it.
So there are 7 of each, I believe.
7 each in both of them?
Yeah.
You take.
Well, 7 verses that I found.
You take one.
Isn't this fun?
Yeah, it kind of is that. Oh, we want becoming, not beginning. Oh, I messed up right from the start. Does become work besides becoming? Has become?
Yeah.
Or became?
Became or yeah.
It doesn't say to be.
Yeah, so it would be, was or to be, or becoming, right? So find all the references to Jesus as was, which all the ones that I have are was, and then became. For the second one is actually more became, because it's all in past tense.
It's easy.
Yeah, what would you think it was?
Cause to be, this is tricky.
Send him a text, tell him.
You could do it and just get maybe one more minute.
There's probably more. Major.
I've got 11 so far on what I think is the thing. I didn't do that once.
Oh, I got lost a long time ago.
All right, 15
I
seconds.
did that like
Probably more on that.
Oh, yeah. I just worked on this to be.
All right, y'all.
y'all.
Let's see what you got here. All right, so for was, I'm looking for like the verse. Okay, it might happen a couple times in the verse, but what verses or what time? When does it say in the text like the word was being used?
1 and 2.
Yeah, so we got verse 1 and verse 2 and verse 4,
9,
9,
10,
10.
15, and 17 on the right side.
Okay. Verse 8. Let me see 17. Maybe I missed one.
No, it's 8.
Because the law was given through Moses, grace and truth became through Jesus Christ. Yeah, I missed one.
10, 15, and 17.
Yeah, all right. And so here's what those verses, say. So if you wanted to look at that. Right, so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. He was not the light, referring to John. John was not the light, so Jesus was the light. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through Him. Verse 15, John bore witness of Him and cried out, saying, "This was He of whom I said." So, every time we see the word was being used, at least in these references, who's it always referring to?
Jesus.
Jesus. Right? So, when we use the... Alright, so we all know what like the be verbs are Okay, so we've got, what are all?
Am, is, are, was, were.
Yeah. Am, is,
Glad I'm a teacher.
was, were, be, being,
Been.
and been. Right, so these are all the verb forms of the word be. Oh yeah, are.
Am, is, are, was, were.
Yep. All right, so the use of these words have a very specific meaning, right? So to be, right? So when God says I am, I am that I am is the technical word there, right? So he's just saying I exist, right? I'm just the one, I am the being that just exists, right? So Jesus here is picking up on was, which has a very similar idea there going on, in that Jesus just was, right? There is no beginning to Jesus. He brings the beginnings, right? He began the world. He began creation, and so all of that. So Jesus just was. Now, for all of the becoming, right? So what are all the becoming references?
That one was tough.
3 you got it in a couple times.
Yep.
I think. 10
But if you want to know, when you go back,
6 has become.
becoming, I mean, he is going to. If you go to that, it's like, what do I say? That he.
Is it raining?
He's going.
Sounds like it.
Wow.
Yes. Certainly no, you can see
Is it?
I only can see it on the fence. so-
14, 12 and 14.
What's verse 12 say
It
again?
is. I'll be back.
Oh,
Your phones are down, they are.
Windows
Gave
are
them
down.
authority to become children of God.
Okay, yep. I missed one on my next slide. And the last verse, which has it twice.
Or 15 has it,
What's verse 15?
the one coming behind me became ahead of me.
Okay, yeah.
And 17 became through Jesus Christ.
Okay. So I missed a couple there. Excuse me, I'm not perfect.
You're forgiven.
All right, so
Lord's dead grace.
all things became through him. What's that talking about? It's talking about the world, right? And creation.
Yeah.
All right, so John the Baptist became a witness. So there it's referring to John's role, right? Verse 10, the world became through him, going back into creation, right? Verse 12, what's verse 12? Also have verse 11.
Become children of God.
Yeah, become children.
Oh, I just have the wrong number down on the screen. That's what's going on there. All right, so the believers became God's children. So at one point they were not God's children, and then they became means that at some point they then
changed.
were. Yeah. So the children of God. Okay. Verse 14, the Logos became flesh. Now this is the first time Jesus is becoming something that he wasn't already before.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So he is taking on a new...
Bodily form.
Right. Oh, wow.
It's not raining. It's
Wow.
I'm glad you said something.
Your windows down.
So,
I should have known better.
We're awful trusting.
well, I didn't know it was supposed to rain.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
Until tomorrow.
So the Logos became flesh. Jesus took on flesh. It's something that he was not before, but now he has.
Mm.
All right. So verse 15. What's verse 15 say? Because I don't have that one.
John witnesses concerning him, having cried out, saying, "This one was whom I said, the one coming behind me became ahead of me, because he was before me."
Okay. So yeah, that one's kind of confusing because it's about
Behind me became ahead of me.
right. So and that's referring to I would say time. Right, so he was back here in reference to time, but now his time has come for him to bloom, as it were, as the Messiah. So.
Well, that's because he became flesh and he'd never been that before.
Yeah.
Ta-da!
Yeah, and the time has come, right, for his
Yeah.
ministry to begin.
Makes it look
So.
better.
And then verse 17, the law became through Moses. So at one point there was no law, and then Moses comes down from the mountains with the 2 tablets, right? So, and then grace and truth became through Jesus. So there is a new grace and truth that is coming that was not there before, right? So law and grace and truth. So there is a new grace, which again I would say goes back to what we're talking about over here with the grace and grace becoming grace in place of grace. All right, so when we talk about words that John uses very intentionally, right? So he's using a form of the verb to be, to say that Jesus always was. And he's contrasting that with what was not always was, but what has come into existence. And he's drawing a very black and white distinction between those two things. And trying to give as much authority and power and reverence and awe to this Logos and what he has done and what he is continuing to do. So it is in just the 2 different words, he's teaching us about who Jesus is. Okay, so when we talk about Christology, which is what we've been talking about, by the way, the whole evening, what is Christology? What does that mean? Anybody know what Christology means?
Breaking down terms and meanings of words.
It's the study of Christ.
Yeah, okay, so it's the study of Christ. So Christology is a compound word. It's 2 words shoved together, right? Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew Messiah, or anointed one, which is what Christ and Messiah both mean. Anointed one. Ology would be like biology, right? Study of. And specifically, it's, if you like, a direct translation would be words about. So it's words about Jesus, or theology, words about God. So, all right, we don't have time for our next project, so I'm going to make this homework. All right, and that's what we'll introduce with next week. And that is read the entirety of John chapter 1, which you're going to be reading that anyways, because you're going to have to be reading the gospel again, right?
This is with a partner. We can read it together.
and list all the descriptors or titles that you find about Jesus. Okay, so John chapter 1 is entirely a introductory chapter, and he is telling us so much about who Jesus is, and he gives all kinds of descriptions and he, more importantly, titles of who Jesus is. And if you read through it, notice he climaxes, right, with those titles. So he's going to start out with generic things, and I believe build up to the title that he wants us to carry through the rest of the gospel. So spend some time reading through John 1 and just list all those out. I have found 18, and that was just in an initial reading. You may have more than that. You may have less than that, which is completely okay. All right, so that means now, and then answer these questions too, all right, which we don't have time. And then, oh look, we were going to talk about dwelling there, right? But we already did that, so, which is good. Eskenosin, which is.
I'm going to say Eskenazi.
Yeah.
In verse 15, when it said, it's interesting because when it says John testified concerning him and exclaimed, this was the one of whom I said, the one coming after me has surpassed me because he existed before me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
John was older.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
you know, if you understood that part,
right.
most people would.
Right.
John was older.
Right.
He was 6 months older than Jesus.
Yep.
But it's interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Because they knew that.
Mm-hmm.
They knew John was older. They knew he was preparing the way, but he says that he existed before him. Well, how could that be, John? You're older.
Right. Yep. All right, so for our final thoughts this evening, a bit of a takeaway, if you were. Again, I have it there for you with the main idea up on the screen. So tonight we've been talking about Christology, right? We've been talking about who Jesus is and specifically what John seems to be saying about him, and in the introduction of his glorious gospel, right? And he's already told us so much in just 18 verses, and he's going to tell us even more in the rest of the first chapter. So Christ has always been and always will be the defining point of Christianity. He is what the religion and faith are all about. That is why so much controversy, heresy, and debate, remember going back to one of the tenets of John's worldview, was heresy. So in John's day, by the end of the first century, just 60 years or so after Jesus' death, there are already fractions occurring in Christendom to redefine the person of Jesus. This is why the study of Jesus is so important for all believers in churches. When we agree on who this person is and what he came for, we can have true unity in truth. Over the last 2 millennia, there have been several false claims made about Jesus. Many of them stem from this gospel, which ironically was written at least, if not written primarily, for the clearing up the identity of the Messiah. And John's picture of Jesus is that he is God, equal to the Father, yet distinct. That he is the author of creation, the one who sent the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, and the one who justifies our sins. He was here in the flesh, lived an earthly life apart from his glory in heaven, forsaken by the Father, and justified the people of the world. As we continue in our culture, the push will be to dilute who Jesus was and to confuse him with a moral, righteous teacher or someone who never existed at all. Yet we can stand firm on the word of truth that Jesus is God in the flesh who died for all of us, and when we put our faith in him, we will be resurrected to glory with him on the last day. Jesus makes our faith distinct from any other religion in the world. And with that, let's go very quickly to the other handout that I gave you. The excursus, which is just a fancy way of saying
Language.
and it's an add-on, a specific study of, right? So now we all have we all had the experience of somebody knocking on your door, right? And they have a little name tag and then maybe they're from the Mormon Church or Jehovah's Witnesses, right? And while we want to be loving, certainly, to all of God's creatures, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe, require a special dose of grace. Okay? An extra gift of love given their way in order for us to be somewhat hospitable to them, I suppose, right? So, for somebody who like me, who really admires theology and the discussion of theology, right? The Jehovah's Witnesses, and who I'm specifically going to target tonight, but the Mormons included, are just off the rocker crazy, right? And just make up all sorts of nonsense about who Jesus is. Okay? And I used to work at Starbucks, and you've probably heard me tell this in sermons before, but in any given night, I would work with a Mormon, also a Jehovah's Witness, an atheist, and a gay ordained minister. So that was an experience I will never forget.
How old were you when you did
Oh, I was married. It was Erica and I's first year of marriage, so this was in 2010. So just 7 years ago, and it would not go. Every time we worked, right? We all worked the late evening shift, and every night, man, they would have questions for me. And I never initiated them. They just did it, and walked right into it. So, anyways, as far as with the Jehovah's Witnesses' problem with Jesus, right? So they're gonna talk to you about if they ever come to your door. I want to weaponize you, equip you with an argument against them about who Jesus is, right? Because John is clearly making the concept clear that Jesus is God, right? Same equal grounds as God the Father, equal grounds as God the Son. And to ignore that is, I'm sorry, ludicrous. Sorry, if you really want my opinion on the matter. So,
but it's not your opinion, it's what the Scripture
well, yeah,
will verify.
I'm talking about my opinion of them. But so, Jehovah's Witnesses believe the Word, or the Logos, is a God, not the God. Okay? And that is a very important distinction for them, even though if they knew the little bit about Greek, they would realize that is not an argument at all. Okay, so here's basically how their thinking works, right? So Jesus is the only son that God created by Himself. Jehovah used the pre-human Jesus as His master worker in creating all other things in heaven and on earth, but Jesus Himself was created by Jehovah. Right, or who they would refer to as Jehovah, which is also, by the way, not an actual name of God that's in the Bible. So, but that's a whole other discussion. So here's a quote from one of their works. Does this, John 1:1, so in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Does this mean that Jehovah God, Elohim, and the Son are two persons, but at the same time one God and members of a so-called Trinity or Triune God? When religion so teaches, it violates the Word of God, wrests the Scriptures to the destruction of those who are misled, and insults God-given intelligence and reason. The confusion is caused by the improper translation of John 1-3. Such translation being made by religionists who try to manufacture proof for their teaching of a Trinity. So, the response, all right? So, we're going to get into this a little bit. Here's the initial, this is verse 1 in the original Greek. All right? And if you can see it, it's on your page there. But there's the actual word-for-word translation. So the word below the word is actually like what that is. So it's going to sound odd. But in beginning was the Word, and the Word was before the God, and God was the Word. Okay, now, Amy, you're probably going to have to help us out here.
What?
But the distinctions between a definite article and an indefinite article. Okay, so what is a definite article?
Oh gosh, I don't know. It's been a while.
The A-N?
The
Yeah.
Yeah, so the is a definite article.
Yes.
right? A and an are an indefinite article. Okay, so when I say the table, I'm specifically referring to one table. If I was to say a table, it could be any of these tables.
Right.
All right, so that's the difference between a definite article and an indefinite article. Now, you see these little, what looks like an O with a funny little mark above it, right? So there's one there.
It looks like a Sedalia.
There's one right there. This is also, by the way, the same word, and that's also one right there. So if you look below it, you see that is the word the. All right, so the Word, and here it is again, the Word was before the God, and God was the Word. So their entire argument that Jesus, this Logos, was not the God hinges on the fact that Theos right here has no definite article in front of it. And so therefore, God here must be referring to a lesser God, right? Maybe a mighty God like we would see in Isaiah, right? But not Elohim, not Jehovah, Yahweh, right? So that this is referring to Yahweh, this one must be referring to a different God, right? That's, in a nutshell, their argument, that Jesus is not the same as God of Israel, right? So there's a few things wrong with that thinking, okay? First of all, in the Greek, the presence of a definite article or the lack thereof really means little to anything, okay? Sometimes it's there for emphasis. Other times it's an extra word. Words can share a definite article, right? So it's just like, if the fact that it's not there doesn't mean anything. And I put it in red to show that it's not there. And in your handout, you have all the times that God comes up, right, are highlighted in either green or red. And what you'll notice is that the only times that we see God in green are in verse 1 and 2. Every other instance, it's in red. Now, are we supposed to bite and eat the fact that all those other references are not referring clearly to God, like God the Father, God Yahweh, right? Or could it be that one of these other instances of theos without the definite article also refers to Yahweh God? So are you tracking with me? Like in order for their argument to be true, it must be consistent. So is their argument consistent all throughout the first 18 verses? No. And no, it is not. Not at all, right? If you go through and you look at all of them, a couple times you might be able to, like if you were to put on your little Jehovah Witness hat, right, and think like one for a little bit, you might say, okay, I can see how there's a distinction there, but verse 18, I believe, is the defining crux of the matter, right? It is clear in verse 18 that this is referring to God, right? So no one has seen God at any time, clearly referring to Yahweh. All right? No one has ever seen God. But is there a definite article in front of that form of God?
No.
No, there's not. Only begotten God, clearly referring to Jesus, being in the bosom of the Father, the same narrated about him. So, there in verse 18, two instances of God. One being used to describe the Father, one being used to describe the Son. Neither of them have a definite article. So the next time you have a Jehovah Witness come to your front door and you say, you know what, I believe that Jesus is God because of John 1:1. They're going to say, well, you should know that there's not a definite article in front of that. And then you pull out this little handout that I gave you. And you say, but look here. All the instances of theos, right? And here in verse 18, clearly referring to God. I mean, how do you argue that one, right? And then they get nervous. And it's fun when they get nervous. All right? Because they start twitching. And they always send two people. There's always a newbie, right? And an expert. And the expert gets real worried, right? And the younger one might start arguing with you. And that's when things start falling apart. All right? So, let me just say Christian love here, okay? Do this in Christian love. But we are to be prepared with an answer against the people who are fighting, on the very grounds of our faith. And that is Jesus. And we need to call it out for what it is. Because if we just love them and we don't share the truth with them, they're going to hell. Because they do not have Christ. So with that...
So they think Jesus then was just created for a purpose, like a prophet, but then he died. He didn't resurrect. He just died, and there was no Trinity.
I think they believe that he was resurrected from the dead, but they do not put him on the same level as God.
No, he was just a
There's no
good...
Trinity then in their faith.
No Trinity. The Holy Spirit is just the power. It's like the electric bolt of God, right? So they even say the Holy Spirit is not a person of God, and so, yeah.
But the sad thing is, which to me it is a sad fact of so many people, even in the churches of Christ and the Christian church, won't stand flat-footed and say, you're lost. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Oh, we can't say they're not Christians. Well, they're not.
No, they're not. And I'll stand that and say that any opportunity that I get. So let's pray, and thank you all for being here this evening. I went 5 minutes over, so I apologize again.
We're going to keep track of all this minutes.
I know, I'm up to like 15 minutes now, so all right. Would somebody mind closing us out in a word of prayer?
Sure.
All right.
Gracious Father God, we just thank you for the time together tonight, and when we are together and the Spirit is alive and active and we share in each other's lives, conversations, thoughts through a study, it just emboldens us to continue on our walk and to be bold in that walk. So we give you the praise and the glory for that. And thank you for Jonathan and the preparation that goes into these studies, and that we will be just that, more able to defend the faith, to be able to proclaim the faith, and always in the manner of love, but in the manner also of the extreme importance and the timing of people coming to know you, Jesus, as their Savior. So that's the takeaway tonight, Father, is that we have to be going out into our witness field and spreading the word. So be with each of us as we return home, and just give us that burning desire in our heart to serve you and to spread the news. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thanks for you being here.